first question, I can just open it to you, is like, when you hear, well, how should I say it? What are your fundamental objections to Jordan Peterson? Whether it's like his ideas, his communication style, anything like that.
Yeah, it's very broad. I mean, for me to think, what's the where should I sort of start off? Like, what's the most important objection? Maybe would be like a good one
Sure.
to give
Yeah.
first. If from my point of view, like I think the most important objections might be I see the sort of worldview that he's putting forward, um, and I've got to be careful not to use almost trigger words because I do think he gets strawmanned by a lot of people on the left, right?
Sure.
So I think,
Definitely. Yes.
and they'll say things like, that it's kind of like a pipeline to the alt right or something like that, and I think that their idea of what's going on there is kind of fundamentally confused. But I do have a similar sort of objection in that I think that some of his philosophical points are a bit confused and can lead people into belief systems which are going to kind of like maybe be harmful for them in certain ways or isolate them from being able to participate from like society in more healthy ways.
Sure.
And so it's not that there's this kind of like straight pipeline or something, like there's some conspiracy theory where
Right.
it
Right.
leads to people becoming alt-right or something. But it's just that, so I mean I went through this myself, right? And that's probably what's motivating some of my dislike of some of the ideas is that I feel like as I adopted some of Peterson's views on things, I basically developed false beliefs about things, and that led to me having like weird conversations at work. It led to me developing kind of like strange religious beliefs, or becoming like
Sure.
a kind of religious fundamentalist, having strange ideas about relationships as well. Like, and I think I hurt myself and my partner because of the ideas of responsibility in Peterson's work, or his approaches to relationships and
Interesting.
sexuality as well, and things like that. So,
Sure.
I mean, there's a lot that can be said about
Yeah.
each of
Yeah.
those things, but that's the objection broadly is just that I think it can lead to false beliefs, and those false beliefs can hurt people,
Yeah.
basically.
And we could go down a number of roads. So that's interesting. So, um, I guess so. The point you said about responsibility, um, you had some false beliefs about responsibility that were somewhat negative or something like that. That's actually one of the things that I would say something similar, where, um, Jordan Peterson, it's like, he's speaking to millions of people, right? So he's giving advice that is inherently going to be generalized, but that doesn't mean that, and the natural conclusion of that is going to be some of the advice he's giving might work for a broad, swath of the population, but for some people it doesn't work. And I remember him saying something effective like, people need to adopt more responsibility. And then he said something like, it's possible to adopt too much, but that's a rarer problem. But I think fell into that category where it was like, I'm now going to take on everyone else's problems as, my own, like, all the suffering in the world, it's on me to do. Um, so I'm curious, what was your experience with that, with taking on too much responsibility, or if that's what it was or something like that?
Maybe your experience there might be a little bit different to
Sure.
mine. For me personally, the way that I integrated that message into my life, it was more to do with work and this idea of being like work as in my what my career was, what I should be satisfied with, what I should do, and also my romantic relationship as well. So, I was 21 and I was doing a degree apprenticeship at the time, so I was working full time as a software engineer at this place. And I think that the work environment there, now looking back, was kind of fairly toxic and unhealthy in a lot of ways.
Sure.
And the relationship that I was in just wasn't a good one for me for a bunch of reasons. But as a result of the kind of message that Peterson was putting forward, I was like, well, I've got to take these things seriously. So if I'm finding it bad, the problem's with me. And what I need to do is, somehow make myself be okay with the responsibility of just going to this workplace every day and doing this thing that isn't satisfying, because that's kind of like what a man does. And then I'll
Sure.
work on this relationship, and we'll like buy a house and get married young, because this is taking on all that responsibility, and that's like the correct pattern of living, to kind of lean into. And I think that was really wrong. I was very naive.
Sure.
I think in that workplace in particular, they were really above my pay grade to resolve or contribute to in any sense. Like, because this is a big company with places, you know, in it, with buildings and organizational structure across different continents. You know, it's like I can't restructure that. I can't say stop being like toxic in this specific way that you structure hierarchy, the kind of like high corporate hierarchy that you have, and the way that people have to, you know, play the internal politics to climb that ladder rather than
Right.
focusing on the things that matter. I think in that situation I was better off just sort of like leaving when I could and going to work somewhere else that was healthier. And I mean, I eventually did do that, but you know, I didn't feel like it. I didn't feel like that was the right course of action to take. I think because of some of the messages that were being put across by Peterson that I kind of integrated into my life. And I think there's similar themes, you know, in the relationship as well, where I probably held onto that or got made that too serious when there were kind of red flags and incompatibility issues between us. And definitely with the idea of like buying a house young and being prepared to have a family young and things like that. I mean, we both wound up getting way more hurt than we should have been as 21, 22-year olds in a relationship. You know, it could have just been that we just split up, but instead there's like a mortgage involved and all that stuff.
Sure, because
And
you felt you needed to take the responsibility and do all these things when it wasn't necessarily
exactly.
prudent at the time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's one of the outcropping. That's one of the ways the kind of message manifested in my life as this negative thing. And there's even like little things within that, you know. So, for example, conversations I would have had with people where I would have said that their ideas were kind of like cultural Marxism or something, right? And they just weren't. I just wasn't engaging in political discourse in a very healthy way. Like I couldn't really see the various different like economic or social policies that people sort of favored in different areas, and I couldn't see the diversity between those different positions. You know, like someone can have like different economic ideas than they do about like social ideas and stuff, and it was just all intertwined because anyone who disagreed with me about certain things was kind
Was
of
a
like branded
postmodern
as being on the left.
neo-Marxist? Yeah.
Yeah, that
Right.
sort of thing. And I kind of did think that there was this big conspiracy theory, you know, going on behind the scenes with like HR departments and the universities and stuff to put forward this ideology. And I mean, I think there are people who have really bad ideas who are in those circles, you know, that I disagree with about that, like their views of feminism and stuff like that now. But I don't think that there's this big sort of like conspiracy and, you know, like a one feeding into the other, and they're trying to like bring down the West or displace the man as the head of the family, like all these sorts of things that I used to believe. And I think that those views alienated people as well. But
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah, I definitely get the idea of like, if you start explain like you're in a workplace talking to someone, you're like, well, this is, don't you understand? The postmodern neo-Marxists are doing this and all that. It's like, okay, you're on a different planet. Um, that
well,
I
they had quite
understand.
harmful. They had quite harmful diversity schemes at the place that I was at. So I mean, I was definitely unfairly treated in comparison to my like female colleagues
Sure.
because they wanted to have, you know, they wanted to be able to say, look, we've got these like young women in who are on like the fast track to management, and so look how diverse we are. And I mean that was unfair, but then I filtered all of this through this story of like this big,
Conspiracy lens. Yeah. Right.
of like the postmodern neo-Marxism taking over,
Right.
and that just wasn't helpful, and it meant I couldn't have healthy conversations with people about these issues as well
Sure.
because everything was
Yeah, there's definitely, um, I think, a risk of flattening the idea, like, well, it's just a conspiracy versus, well, maybe this is, it's an ideology that hijacks people's good intentions and only hijacks a part of it so that they pursue these, unfair policies or something like that. Um, so okay, so that's interesting. So, I guess as it relates to, because I watched I think two of your videos kind of going into the what would you say, the philosophical issues that kind of Jordan Peterson puts forward, and like one of the things, and this is what Rationality Rules made the video about, was the whole idea of the Bible is literally the first book and all that, and I'm like, and Stephen pointed out specifically of like, well, what Jordan Peterson fans will do is, well, he said literally the
modern
first book,
daily.
right?
Yeah.
The mot is, he said literally the first book. But what he really meant was metaphorically the first book, and it's like, Man, I that was literally my thought process of like, well, he doesn't mean literally, and still I struggle with it because it's like clearly
He does say, he
he
says,
says
and
literally.
I mean that. I mean
I know. He
literally.
doubles down
Yeah,
on it, which is like the,
exactly.
and that's the
Which
thing.
makes it hard
I know, and
yeah.
it's like I have to. I know that he knows that like that obviously literally wasn't the first like book that was
I honestly
written.
don't know what he knows. So I think
Well, fair,
so.
fair. I suspect
I'm
he
going off
does.
of, well, but I suspect he would in this kind of environment if questioned. But I think that going on the Joe Rogan podcast at that point in time, the week before, he'd just been to the Bible Museum, and the Bible
Yeah,
Museum
he's
is
talking about
ran
that.
by evangelicals, and it's kind of like a lot of New Testament scholars object to the kind of information that's put forward in there. Let's put it that way,
Sure,
right?
sure, sure.
It diverges from the kind of scholarly consensus about a lot of these issues, and so I think Peterson might have had floating around, in the back of his mind,
Yeah,
the information that was presented to him there, and maybe that's just what came up in the course of the conversation, right?
yeah.
And maybe he'd think about it if someone was there to question him, but.
Well, he definitely, and I think someone else pointed out, like he said something effective. Like he was pointing at two snakes coiling together, and he said something like, "I really
Yeah, and the
think this
double helix and the DNA.
is DNA or something like that." And then I saw a video of him later being questioned, and someone's like, "You said that the two snakes, were literally DNA or something like that." And Peterson was like, "Well, he's like, I have my suspicions. I don't mean literally whatever." And
But I think that shows. Sorry
go
to
ahead.
interrupt, but I think that if you really go back and read, I mean, Galen's one of the first, sort of in the classical period, people who's really kind of doing medicine, right? And you can read his stuff, and he does these interesting experiments. So, for example, he had like a selection of different eggs, and on different days, he'd open them up to see what was going on inside and document, like how the chick would be developing inside the egg, and also like quite gruesome experiments to do with, because in the Aristotelian philosophical system, it's like consciousness is centered in the heart because that's kind of like where it feels like, I guess, or
Yeah, versus the
maybe it's
head or
it's more
something. Yeah,
cultural. Yeah, and there were these gruesome experiments or shows, I suppose, that Galen would put on, where there'd be like a pig, and they'd cut the pig open, and they'd grasp its heart, and it would still be like squealing in pain, and then they'd grasp the brain, and it stopped squealing in pain, and they'd be like, yeah, that. So you can kind of see by
sure.
elimination that it's, and but the interesting thing is, if you read medicine from that period, and you read kind of how brutal it is, or there's theories about semen being stored in the brain, like that's what the brain's for, or like people really didn't have, there wasn't like micro molecular biology.
Yeah, it was
Like people didn't have a theory
pre-scientific.
of,
Right.
yeah, they're not even trying to do science in the sense that we think of it, and so I think it really is off the table to be like, yeah, they had some idea of DNA or something
Right,
like that.
right, right. And I think my, interpretation, which is very limited and through the scope of, I've gone through a decent amount of Jordan Peterson's lectures. I take notes, and so I have a idea. I have a of his total philosophical picture. I have some parts filled in, some parts very detailed, some parts I don't understand at all. My understanding of that is something like the idea of like spontaneous intimation and revelation can kind of just come upon people. Like I think what wasn't it? I think like Tesla like did channeling or something like that. And when you look at like the rituals and routines of a lot of these figures in the past that we just kind of view as one dimensional people, and that we just view them for their accomplishments, they're actually very complex and whatnot. And so he's making that sort of Jungian synchronicity case that this was like a divine revelation thing, which like those ideas, and maybe this would be interesting to get into, is like when I first was reading Jung, because I was introduced through Jordan Peterson. He was talking about dreams and how like dreams could be like have a lot of information in them and stuff. And I remember I was in the library at school, and I was reading, and I literally like put the book down and kind of looked up, and I was like, okay, what? Like he said something about like dreams being predictive of the future. And right off the bat, I'm like, okay, that's goofy. And I still don't buy the idea of like causality outside of space time or something like that. But certainly like when it gets into the realm of like psychedelics and mystical experience and religious phenomenology, there's so much there that like, and I've had experiences. I have very vivid dreams that I've started recording more, and I found them to be like oftentimes they'll have very like strong narrative structures that's almost like this is like a movie, and I don't know if it's the same for you or other people. But and then experience with psychedelics, it's like it's not that you can make any claims about metaphysics outside of it's not that you can make any like valid claims about the metaphysical nature of reality, but I think what it has done is just open my mind to the possibility of, well, like this idea that the archetypes act through, the archetypes are the patterns of behaviors that have been selected for over millions of years, and that, there's, what would you say? We're evolved in some sense to respond to these archetypal patterns of behavior. It's like, it gets very squirrely right off the bat, and, it's requires great skepticism, which again, I appreciate people like you and Sam Harris, putting the check on it and saying, hey, it's not literally the first book in the Bible, Jordan. But I guess, what are your thoughts about sort of these ideas of like, that the way that we perceive the world is in terms of narrative, and that, any moral system sort of requires at the base of it some sort of faith-based or sort of mythological component that isn't subject to rational explanation or critique. Do you have any ideas or thoughts on that? I know it's a broad question.
I do.
So.
Yeah, I do have thoughts on those things. Again, I'm just sort of thinking, where's the best place to kind of come at answering that question. I suppose I should preface or caveat like everything that I say with, I'm really not an expert in any of these areas, right?
Oh,
I'm a guy with some opinions.
Yes.
And even when it comes to think about like Freudian or Jungian psychology, those two I haven't really looked into other than reading a few like intro or historical overview chapters like 2 or 3 years ago. So.
Part of me feels guilty sometimes even doing these videos because it's like, man, I know I'm making mistakes all the way, but it's in part just trying to, by speaking out loud and kind of talking about this ways, it's like that at least narrows it down to figure out where the gaps are, so to speak.
Something that I've come to appreciate, I suppose, in these discussions about sort of theoretical entities, right, is the process that we go through in building a model about the way that reality is. So what I mean by the way reality is like, what's reality made up of and what kind of things exist. So in the sciences, for example, you might need to postulate some entity in order to explain something. Like you might be driven by some experimental data to postulate, like, well, there must be these things called electrons that exist, because how else do you explain, like these in the gas go through when you do such and such, and then you've got this other phenomena, and then it's like, oh, hang on, now all of a sudden if we postulate this extra thing, it unifies our explanations. And
right.
So
well, like the atom was like a mythological idea first and foremost. It wasn't like it was posited that the smallest unit of matter was called the atom. That was back in the classical era, and then then it was okay. Now we have a more protons, neutrons, electrons, but it was first like postulated as a mythical idea, so to speak.
Yeah, I think I mean that's right, and there's a lot of complex history even behind, linking those ideas together, because it's not. So when you get kind of like more modern atomic theory, I mean, they genuinely thought they were getting to the smallest kind of unit of what the universe is made up of, and then obviously that turned out to be false, and but I suppose my point is, I always have difficulty with the kinds of claims that Peterson makes, because it's not clear to me what his explanations are doing, and like what he's not very precise about the kind of entities that he's speculating about the existence of, and why they, firstly, like what work they do as an explanation, like how does this work? How does it interact with things? How does it unify like different phenomena that we're trying to explain? And also comparison, right? So there's always competing explanations. There's people don't agree on these things. So what makes this explanation like better than others that people should accept it? And maybe there's certain theoretical virtues that this explanation has that others don't have. So it might be that we're actually already committed to the existence of 3 other things in our background beliefs, and we can fully explain the thing we're trying, in terms of some combination of those three other things, rather than adding some new thing. And so
Sure.
maybe it would be more parsimonious to go with just those three other things than adding a new kind of, these are the sort of considerations that I think should be taken into account in comparing these sort of. I mean, I view what Peterson's putting together more as like a metaphysical worldview, rather than, but maybe he's also making sort of like psychological claims as well. And then there'd be questions about, well, is there any empirical content to the psychological claims that he's making? And if there is, how do we go about either like verifying or falsifying that in tests and things? And those are the sorts of things that I'm interested in for the models that Peterson is putting forward. But it seems like he's not as interested in being specific and precise. He sort of does make a lot of these general claims about the way that the world is. But even amongst people who are committed to his ideas, it's not really clear how to best interpret them or what he means, or, if he's saying something
Sure.
very like obviously false to something that's maybe plausibly true, but it's not clear in what sense it's significantly true or informative. And so yeah, those are some of the difficulties that I
Yeah,
have.
I think and he's articulated this is
I didn't answer. Sorry, I didn't answer the last bit, but I
about
can
the
come
archetypes.
back to
Yeah,
that question
yeah,
about.
because I want
Yeah,
to. I'll provide a more concrete kind of example to go after. But to your point about he does his lectures where he just gets in front of an audience and just kind of talks. He's got his PowerPoint, or but sometimes he just goes for an hour or so. And I think the value of that is he just it's thinking out loud, right? And when you do that, you're going to make mistakes. And I agree there is a danger in, well, he is on a stage, professing his thoughts, which he, by his own admission, admits are error filled, but he's thinking in real time, so to speak. And there is a danger in terms of people who watch him will think, okay, well, everything because he says a lot of things that are correct and very strong and unique and I think valuable, but then conflating, well, therefore everything he says must be of that same level of quality if he's getting up in front of people and professing it. Where I do see the danger in that. But I do think there is value in sort of modeling that sort of, I don't know what you would call it. It's not a dialectic, so to speak, but that thinking in real time. And I think that's where that danger occurs. But so,
I
okay.
definitely think it.
Go
I
ahead.
think it is valuable. I agree. But I think there are people who I aim to be like as like a communicator of ideas who I think do this in a slightly different way. So I've got a friend called James Fodor, for example, right? And he's really good at doing this, where we might kind of disagree on something, right? And we'll kind of flesh it out a bit, and it won't be clear what we're saying. But then at the end of that kind of like dialectic sort of process, he'll always make an effort to sort of precisely state what it is that we've just talked about in as clear terms as possible for himself and the audience. And I think that that's important because then it becomes really clear what he's saying and what that applies to, what it means. Whereas with a lot of the stuff that Peterson says, I'm honestly, like I've spent, and this could just be my memory because it was about 4 or 5 years ago that I watched most of his stuff, but I'm still really not clear what he actually believes about the way that the world is constituted, or like
Sure.
he says things, but they're just so open to interpretation or
Right.
sort of hard to pin down that I'm just not sure what his claims really are about a lot of these things.
Right. Well, yeah.
Yeah,
Let's try and get into that because, like I said, I'm I'm not the Peterson whisper. I am a dumbass. So I try my best to understand his ideas and then apply them as I understand them. So
sure.
I'll try and put them forward, and then you can tell me your perspective on them. So this idea that he says like everyone is religious, right? Even atheists are religious. He says when asked does he believe in God, he says, well, I act as if God exists, and that's good enough for me. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of that being a good or a bad thing? Or, as an atheist, like I very much understand the perspective of someone who, like, someone who critically thinks about their beliefs. Says, I'm an atheist. I just don't require a God in my belief system. And then this Canadian guy comes along and says, yeah, you're a Christian. You just don't realize it. It's like, all right, douche. Like, I get that. So what are your thoughts on like statements like those?
Quite difficult to unpack again because there's a lot of interpretive work that needs to be done. This might be one of the areas where I'm somewhat close to what Peterson might be getting at, and that might be like a charitable way of interpreting him or something. Um, I don't know that I necessarily always identify as like an atheist myself. Probably sit more in like an epistemically agnostic sort of camp. I'm definitely more comfortable there. But my view, my view of most words is that they're kind of varied, right? They have a broad variety of different uses and different applications,
Yeah.
and
Words are like
so
tools,
what?
right? And
Yeah,
you
a
gotta
word,
tune them,
a
or like
word
an
like
instrument, like tune it before a conversation or something, right?
oh, not yeah. It depends on what you're doing. Like in certain practices, maybe like the sciences, whatever. There's going to be like a specific use for a word,
Right, a
and
technical
so you want to
definition.
avoid. But I think something that we have in general, and when people philosophize, I think this is something we fall foul of, is a kind of craving for generality, where we look for what's in common between all the different uses of a word to try and get at like what the essence of that word is. And I think that religious is going to, in this case, we might be doing that with religious, where it isn't really clear that religious has like one clear defined, with like really sharp edges meaning. Like here are the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be religious,
Right.
X, Y, and Z. So I think the reason I think it's worth prefacing with that is because then it becomes clear that there's a sense in which Peterson is sort of right, and there's a sense in which what he's saying is sort of wrong, right? So if if he means by religious, um, like deeply held commitments that are not open to rational evaluation within communities or something like that, right? Well, then plausibly, it's like, yeah, people have those. But also plausibly, someone could deny that that is really what religious means. Someone could say, no, by religious, I really mean, communities who have commitments to supernatural entities or,
Right.
theologies based around sacred texts
Right. He says
and
something like
yeah.
the fundamental axioms that you operate on, like that's your religious belief system. And just one note real quick, I think your camera cuts out a little bit, or I think it's on my
Oh,
end.
sorry.
So no, it just there might be
I don't
periods
know what I
where
can do about it.
no,
Yeah,
I
but
don't think so either, and I think it's on my end because if I like adjust the view, it goes back and it fixes. So there may be some gaps in that, but your audio's coming in good, which is fine.
okay.
But so sorry, you
Yeah, he says religion gives us our fundamental axioms, things that
yeah,
aren't
yeah, yeah.
open.
And so I guess here is why I think that is a good, because when we get into linguistics, it's about language. It's like, and I was just on a panel the other night talking about this. It's like words. If we're going to change the definition of a word, we have to, there should be more utility in it, right? Like words can be defined sort of, intersubjectively. And if we're going to redefine words, sort of like, and Jordan Peterson definitely redefines religion. He's in some sense a postmodernist in that sense. He's very,
Right.
offers a lot of different
I
interpretations
agree.
there. Um,
Rather ironically, but
I
yeah,
know,
I
I know,
agree.
I know. But I would say, like, so from my perspective, I think it is useful to conceptualize religion in the way that he does, where he says essentially everyone is religious at like the fundamental psychological motivations you have, your implicit axioms, let's say, your fundamental implicit axioms, you can describe that as your religious framework. And the reason I think that's useful is, and this is kind of a very practical, pragmatic way of looking at it, not from like it's practical because it's good. I mean, like technically, it's a pragmatic perspective. Is like, I think if I were to steel man sort of, let's say, the atheist perspective, which I know agnostic you said, but let's just say the atheist for shorthand. You know, we want to address the dangers of religious dogmatism and religious fundamentalism, right? And I think a common criticism is Jordan Peterson sort of enables fundamentalists, right, by using this religious language and then couching it in such a way where these religious people can have their cake and eat it too, because it's like, oh, look at this secular kind of guy, defending us or whatever. And from my perspective, defining religion in such a way that encapsulates more from a psychological perspective, where you could say, like, if you're a cocaine addict, cocaine is your religion because you will orient your life around it. If you're, money is your god, nationalism is your religion or something like that. I think even though that's a breakaway from the traditional definition, I think it's useful to describe behaviors because, for example, like a jihadist who blows themselves up, that's obvious a religious motivation, but nationalists can do the same thing, and a cocaine addict will kill themselves, lie, cheat, and steal for the sake of this um, belief or desire. And from my perspective, if we're trying to understand what like the problems of dogmatism and fundamentalism, I think it makes sense to conceptualize things like nationalism or wokeism when that's a very boomer way to put it, but the postmodern neo-Marxist perspective or whatever, as falling into the same sort of religious framework where at the bottom of your belief system, and I think this is like the Izod more or less is, at the bottom of any epistemology or moral belief system, you have to make some sort of faith-based claim or non-factual claim. And that from there, logic and rationality is built on top of that. But at the base of it, it's a fundamental sort of faith claim. And describing that in religious language, I think is helpful in understanding what's at the bottom of that, right? So like, just wokeism or whatever is like, well, we're fighting for equality, or we're fighting for social justice, we're fighting against oppression. It's like, those are somewhat abstract terms that can be manipulated in any way, right? And I would say the postmodernist problem is when they define everything in terms of power, even interpersonal relationships or relationships between, two like romantic relationships. Well, it's fundamentally about power because that's the fundamental organizing principle. It's like that is as much of a religious metaphysical claim as, well, God is what organizes the world. Or, like with trans issues, like the idea that someone is born in the wrong body, even, right? Like that's a metaphysical claim, right? And like I've done videos explaining, like, there's absolutely a case to be made for defending the rights of gender dysphoric people who have brains that are similar to the sex that they align with. But as soon as you move into this religious territory, born in the wrong body and all that, you're acting like a religious fundamentalist in some sense. And nationalism, the country is, the purity of the Aryan race or whatever, all that stuff. It's like those all seem to be the same sort of religious, ideas being put forward, and the effect on people's behavior is similar. So I know it's a lot, but I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, there are a lot of things to respond to that, and I'll do my best to remember most of the salient points. I think so. On some of the first things that you were saying, I think this is where what I was saying about religion not necessarily being this clearly defined word comes in. So, okay, let's think about what Peterson's saying about everyone has these religious commitments, right? One of the so that there's this ideological disagreement between, say, conservative religious folks of different ilks. There's like Christians, Catholics, and Muslims, even in Western countries, who have like these religious beliefs, and they resist. Oh, here's my. I feel like my internet might be coming up. Yeah, you got me. Good. And there's disagreement between those groups and secular groups who want to have kind of like secular curriculums taught in schools, secular politics, for example, secular laws, and I think there is disagreement and clashes ideologically between these groups that we sort of observe. And I think the conservative groups, which I mean, someone might disagree with me, right? Who is a conservative? I'm politically, like a little bit conservative, but what I mean is like sort of religiously conservative. Might disagree with me that this is the correct view, but I view some of those positions as being harmful, right? Because I'm sort of in the secular camp where I think the laws and so forth and education should be secular and removed from or not laden with sort of like all of these kind of like religious commitments and stories about the way that the world is. People in those conservative communities, I think, will interpret what Peterson is saying differently from how Peterson understands it himself, but it's still plausibly a good interpretation of what he's saying.
Right.
And I think that this is one of the ways in which what he's saying here might be resisted, because presuppositionalist apologists, for example, are going to say, yes, what Peterson's saying here is exactly right. Romans 1 says that the natural man knows God in his heart, right? So all people actually know God exists, Okay, so yeah, the
You were
thing I was
talking about,
saying
yeah,
was,
fundamentalists interpreting Peterson's message.
yeah, they'll interpret his message slightly different from at least how I think he means it, and maybe he does mean it in more of that way than I'm sort of prone to take him to mean. And I think that that should be resisted for a bunch of independent reasons. Like I don't think that, for example, I think that if someone is honestly convinced that they don't have that belief, then you're not in a position to, kind of like gaslight them, right? And tell them, no, you really do believe it. And they're like, no, look, I'm assessing everything. I'm being honest with you. They're in a position to know if they're being honest with you. You're not in that position. And if you're telling them that, they really don't believe that, then there's a
Sure.
problem with your belief system rather than
Yeah,
theirs,
although
sort of
I
thing.
would say
Uh,
there, like, I can understand, and again, Peterson's a clinical psychologist, and I think that colors a lot of how he talks, because like I could see, for example, like I know people who say that they're friends with someone or say that they really like someone, like, oh, this is, I love this person. It's like, and they don't, and they're miserable, and it's sort of a rationalization to build on themselves. And I think what Peterson does is sort of apply that kind of clinical perspective as if he knows better, which I get in some cases that's true, right? But I
Well, I
think
don't
he's
interpret
applying
him to
that.
be saying this. Yeah, I don't really interpret him to be making this strong of a claim really about people. But
Sure, sure.
I'll get into how I interpret him in a sec. But I think what you're saying there is something interesting in that as well as a kind of criticism of Peterson, because so there's a book called Mistakes Were Made But Not by Me, which is about cognitive biases and heuristics. And actually, there's been a load of issues in America, like the satanic panic, or like what was
Yep,
it? What
the
was the other thing?
daycares.
Yeah, with the daycares, and there was another one of memory recall as well. Like basically a bunch of pseudoscience. Like people who there was a theory about sexual abuse in people in therapy, right? And
Mm,
so people would be coming into therapy sessions, and if they didn't report sexual abuse, then they just had repressed memories, and if they did report it, then they
oh,
brought forward
sure.
their repressed
Yeah,
memories.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so if you as the therapist, are going along with this theory, there's just absolutely no way to, even if you're wrong, for the person to kind of
Right.
vindicate themselves. And there have been a bunch of issues in the past, some of which are documented in that book, with um, like clinical psychologists kind of going beyond their expertise, because as clinical psychologists, they sort of have a certain set of biases about what kind of expertise, right, they get from being in that position. And I think there is a little bit of that sometimes with Peterson. I mean, particularly, it's easier to identify when he talks about um, biblical history, for example, the way the Bible's been composed, or philosophy and things like that. But I do think it can happen when he appeals to being a clinical psychologist from time to time on some of these claims, because as far as I'm aware, these claims about people having religious commitments who claim not to have religious commitments, like, aren't standardly taught in undergrad psychology courses, for
Sure.
example. Like, they're not it's not well accepted background beliefs of professional psychologists, for example. But I don't go with that more conservative kind of interpretation that Peterson could be saying. I think there's something he might be saying that could be close to the truth. Um, I mean, one way of identifying something that might be taken as kind of religious commitments or quasi-religious commitments would be, you can look at a lot of fundamentalist evangelicals who deconvert from Christianity, and there's a sort of belief structure that they've adopted by being raised in evangelicalism, which is about being super convinced that you're right, about really strongly advocating for the kind of beliefs and commitments that you have. And I mean, this is particularly prominent in sort of Southern American Protestant, I mean, like Southern US, by
Mhm.
Not like Protestant communities, right? And you'll see a lot of people who deconvert out of those communities kind of being just as vitriolic or extroverted about their beliefs and things like
Matt
that.
Dillahunty,
Uh,
right?
well, I mean, without saying any names, but
Sure.
but all it is
Yeah, yeah.
each of their beliefs is just the opposite of what it was before, basically. So it's like, well, before I was this on abortion, so now I'm this on abortion. Everything's
Yeah.
just defined as the opposite. And I think there's a sense, right, in which you can use the word religious here and say, well, if there's like a religious structure to belief, there's still this same like religious
Hmm.
structure to the belief system here. But I think that word religious is just being used in different ways in these different contexts. Like, I
Yeah.
don't think there's one meaning of the word religious. And
Do you
so,
think there's
whilst it's,
obvious
yeah,
harm done with that, or like when Peterson does it in this way, do you think that is detrimental to, I don't know, being able to address like classical religious dogmatism or something like that? What's the downside, would you say, of
So
defining it the way that he does?
I think the downside would be when it legitimizes the kind of claims that more fundamentalists, conservative types would want to make about people suppressing the knowledge of God and really having it and stuff like that. Because I think that those philosophies are borderline incoherent when I talk to these people, right? Um, I'm talking specifically about people in this tradition that comes from like a guy called Cornelius Van Til and Greg Bonson of presuppositionalism and John Frame more recently, and people like James White who people may have watched. Yeah, I think that stuff really is harmful, and that you can kind of almost do a case study actually and look at these religious communities in Moscow, Idaho in the US, which is where like Jeff Durbin is, who's a presuppositionalist. You can kind of look at the practices that those communities engage in or how they interact with the community around them. And I've got some people who watch my channel and report to me some of the things they do, and I think you can identify them as harmful, right?
Yeah, sure,
And so maybe
definitely.
I think so maybe Peterson legitimizing the talking points that they have, even if he doesn't quite mean it that way, then
Right.
maybe there's a responsibility to really clarify what he does mean right
Yeah.
there.
Well, and I think it's
Um,
I think like one of the reasons I think Peterson is doing a lot of good when it comes to that religious fundamentalist perspective is because, in some ways you can think of him as like a Trojan horse. Because these fundamentalists, they hear Peterson go, "Oh, there's this guy, and he's talking about the Bible, and he's drawing more people to biblical lectures than church or whatever. He's this great guy. Let's kind of jump on the bandwagon, so to speak." But then, he is fundamentally grounded in like an evolutionary framework, right? Evolutionary psychology is what virtually everything he's doing is based off of. And so, from my perspective, I kind of see it as, well, he's a Trojan horse because all these fundamentalists who are like, "Oh yeah, Peterson's great, Peterson's great," and then if I talk to a fundamentalist, I'm like, Peterson is like, everything he's basing his work on is based in evolution, right? And then now there's the cognitive dissonance. And from my perspective, like, I do see what he's doing as sort of not destroying, destabilizing, or cutting away some of the dogma in the
yeah,
fundamentalism, right? And then
I
bringing a
agree
more
with
secular
that.
perspective. And that's why I think it's really positive. But I do see
No,
that. I've heard it. I've heard it in discourse where these religious people are talking, and I'm like, you're citing Peterson at the same time you're citing these like fundamentalist claims, which he himself, he'll say like fundamentalists are swallowing a bunch of lies. Like he's used that language before. So it's interesting.
yeah. And I think it does need to be clarified because I think what he is could essentially be accused of doing then is basically equivocating because which is to use the same word but just with different meanings, right, in
Mm-hmm.
different cases. So it's like, yeah, I agree with what you mean that it's religious in that if by religious you mean that it shares, like a family resemblance of features with like a
Yeah.
religious belief structure. But if you mean by religious, like it pertains to
Metaphysics or
like
something.
sacred scriptures or supernatural entities, whatever. I definitely disagree. Like that's the and then there's just this linguistic confusion basically because no one's ever clear about this, and then it leads to like this whole set of disagreements that don't need to be there. Um, yeah, and I would be I'm a bit cautious about the evolutionary psychology stuff as well. Like some of the things he says about like snake detection circuitry, or whatever. Like it sort of sounds when someone says like snake detection circuitry, it sounds like it could be plausible or it's technical. But what is really being said here? I mean, there are critiques of a lot of the stuff that goes on in evolutionary psychology, and I think that's because some of the things that go on can be akin to just so stories, right? Kind of
Yeah.
like young Earth creationism, where people will tell you, a just so story about why the tree rings appear to be the way they are,
Right.
given a set of
A
theological background
post hoc
beliefs and
rationalization based on whatever ideology you
exactly.
already have. Right.
Yeah, and I don't know that I've ever really heard Peterson like talk about any of these concerns for the examples that he uses to legitimize the kind of like theological claims that he makes about the role that snakes play metaphorically or as archetypes and things like that. And
Yeah, I think his
I
general
think those,
approach is he takes I think it's a consilience approach, which is I think it was coined by E.O. Wilson, the idea that if you see the same pattern across many dimensions of analysis, so, comparative religion, neuroscience, clinical psychology, something like that, then you can be more certain the pattern is there. So,
What does the pattern being there mean? Like, like, yeah, there's a pattern, right? If you're identifying something, there's a pattern there, right?
Right,
Like that you're
right,
latching onto.
right. Yeah, and if
But
you're looking for that pattern, it's your a priori sort of interpretive structure will project that pattern on there, right? So,
but yeah, so that's what I mean is in what sense is there a pattern there? Like
right,
because you can say there's a pattern there, but that in the same sense that the constellation patterns are also there in the sky, or is it in the sense that you might want to say, and again these are contentious sort of issues, but that like this structure, right, is actually really there. It's not just an arrangement of
sure.
subatomic like molecules, whatever, arranged whatever coit wise, whatever that thing
Yeah,
is
and you
called.
get into like dissipative structures, like a whirlpool in a sink is like, is that structure? That's a pattern, but it's not like a thing in and of itself. So yeah,
Exactly, and it's like, yeah. So I think there's this lack like this is the sort of where it gets into that region where I'm just not clear about what Peterson's actually saying about the way the world is structured, because it's like in one sense I agree there's a pattern there. Like I don't deny that there's a family resemblance of properties or findings between like these different, but what is that extra thing that's trying to be added by drawing out that there, why is it a significant thing to mention that there's this resemblance, or
right.
yeah,
I
and those are the questions you sort of have for Peterson and his
yeah,
world.
I think. Let me think for a second here. Patterns and whatnot. So, are you familiar with his whole idea of the hero archetype, the hero myth being selected
Yeah,
for as an evolutionary feature, so to speak, and that
yeah.
I'm sure you're familiar with like Dawkins' meme theory, right, in memetics,
Hmm.
and his idea that you know memes are self replicators, and they're sort of they exist in their own self or a separate pool of replication. But his perspective is some memes, some elements of culture, so to speak, get ingrained and get selected for over such long periods of time that they become a meme gene kind of co-interaction. So like just to put it practically, he talks about the hero archetype is present in all these different religious stories, and there's an evolutionary reason for that. And so therefore we could say maybe with some reasonable certainty that embodying that hero archetype is the proper path forward, because that will imbue you with the most sense of meaning. It'll be what's good for you, your family across time, and all that. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Well, one thing that I do find interesting is that for Peterson's love of Christianity, how in conflict his hero narrative is really with the orthodoxly conceived Christ, right? Who's so the early Christian community. I mean, what Christians believe has always kind of changed across time. You
Sure.
can look at
Yeah.
different
And
art themes,
different
Christ
sects and all
treated
that.
differently
Yeah.
and stuff. But at least in early Orthodox communities, Christ was always depicted as very kind of meek and mild, and people seeking to imitate Christ would
Mm,
do so by being meek and. It's very different from the kind of hero idea that you might come across in like the Avengers or something like
sure.
that, right? And okay, you can sort of draw on this. Well, there's an element of self-sacrifice to Captain America. He has to give up who he was to become who he would be. But the idea of literally being like feeble and meek, right? Because your reward is set up for you in heaven. That's a very different thing, I think, to sort of this idea of becoming like a bit, big strong American on steroids and like beating up Nazis.
Right. Yes.
Um, so I guess I'm not sure that the world's biggest religions necessarily offer the hero myth in the same sense that Peterson means it. Like I don't know. Maybe if you make it loose enough, you could get to fit these things. But I think there's counterexamples in other cultures as well. If you look at again different Hindu theologies, but that I mean Hinduism. How many people are Hindus in the world? But it's in the billions, right?
Probably.
And
Yeah.
as far as I'm aware, their hero myth, as it were, or the mythological narrative behind their story is about realizing that Atman is Brahman. So like the ego is actually the thing that's simulating the world, kind of like a form of solipsism almost.
Hmm.
Um, and it's unclear to me how that fits in with like like Joseph Campbell's kind of like hero
Yeah.
story and stuff.
I definitely think like if I were to if I were to imagine like, okay, what is the next phase of Peterson's sort of intellectual framework? Like if you take his trajectory outward, assuming he's onto something. The next phase of it, because he's firmly ensconced in sort of a Western Christian kind of ethic, it's like, and he himself admits he doesn't study much of, or doesn't know much about Islam and sort of the Hindu and the Bhagavad Gita traditions. It's like a further integration of those ideas into his framework would be interesting to kind of contrast it. Because Sam Harris made the point that I thought was interesting, that I have trouble getting around, is this like conception of evil. Like there's this archetypal conception of evil that is across religions and across narratives. Like I think it's the Buddhist or the Hindu idea is that evil is just ignorance. It's not actually like pure malevolence or something like that, which is conceptualized differently in Christianity. And it's like, okay, that is a gap of, well, why is there not a more fundamental conception of that idea?
Well, I think so. Maybe to,
and forgive me if I
could
hit
point
my
to a
vape
few.
while we're talking.
It's all right. I could point. Yeah, I could point to a few of these examples. But the general point that I'm making is, again, I think Peterson needs to be precise about the claims that he's making about the way reality is. And if he's making claims that actually entail like empirical content, right, about the way the world has to be, well, then it's open to being falsified by looking at, like the world's largest cultures and them not sharing in this narrative, for example. But he doesn't do those sorts of things, and so you kind of can't do. I can speculate that if he were to precisify his explanation in this way, it would be falsified by these examples. But I can't do that because he sort of hasn't really.
Yeah, he does
done
go
that.
into like Mesopotamian literature, like Marduk is the god who has eyes around his head, and this.
Well, I have issues with his interpretation.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know that he. Okay, he's sort of right. Okay, that there are these stories about Marduk and what Marduk does, but if you talk to ancient Near Eastern scholars about how the people in these cultures would have understood these stories, it differs a fair bit from the way that sort of Peterson thinks about.
Sure.
Peterson sort of thinking of Marduk becoming like this archetypal. Whereas
sorry, you cut out there.
Actually
becoming an archetypal what?
Becoming like an archetypal kind of like Christian god, because so
sure.
Peterson wants to say that the story of Marduk is this precursor that fits really nicely into Christian theology, because you can see so the Christian theology, he wants to say something closer to like the actual, but he would say, I think that over time people are getting closer and closer to that as something as they work through these stories. So maybe here's where a different aspect of the criticism would come in, which is, well, let's compare that to a competing hypothesis, right? And a competing hypothesis is what I think most ancient Near Eastern scholars would tell you about what's going on as you look at actually, there's a really good open source Yale series by Christine Hayes on the formation of the Old Testament, where she talks about some of these things. And the point is just that similarly to what we have today, where you see people who are in religious communities inheriting a set of beliefs and texts and things like that, and then they understand the cultures that they're placed in through that lens. You just have that happening over and over again back through time, and there isn't like you can't point to any one of these points in time and say like that theology latches on to the more true like way things are. But actually, it's just these different beliefs where people inherit them. And so it's not really until the book of Isaiah in the Bible, for example, that you see this conception of monotheism coming through. And then there are historical reasons why that starts happening, and it's to do with them being in captivity at the time that the book's being compiled. And so the idea of God, if the idea of God up to that point has been more kind of physical, like God's really, almost like Zeus or something like that, like God really is an entity, a being that's physical and amongst us and interacts and things like that. And then at that point, all of a sudden, when you're in captivity and all of your icons of God, have been destroyed by the enemy or whatever,
sure.
Well, one way to kind of preserve the theology is to modify what you've inherited and change the theology so as God's actually kind of like out there somewhere. He's more kind of mysterious. And you see this same progression happening over time. You see it with the Hellenization. Obviously, Alexander ends up like conquering a whole bunch of the. There's a lot of complex stuff behind this, and this is a vast oversimplification. But then you get like Greek philosophy, Plato and Aristotle around 450 BC. That interacts with Judaism. So then at the time that you have Jesus living for example, and the early Christians in their communities, they're being influenced by Hellenic philosophy as well as the ideas of Judaism. And so you see some of those influences in, like in the Gospel of John, for example, where you see like more Platonic kind of um, influences as people try to piece together and modify these beliefs that they might have had about Jesus as being an apocalyptic prophet who would restore the Jewish kingdom again, kind of like oppressed by the Romans. But then they modify those beliefs after he's crucified and mix them with
Right.
Platonism and stuff. And I think you can look at this process as just happening through time, people picking up scriptures, modifying them based on the context that they're in. And I think that that's a better explanation than the one that there's like this one true theology and people are like glimpsing into it. And
Sure.
I mean, it involves commitments to less things. Like you might look at the Protestant Reformation or something and say, well, yeah, that's clearly what happened in that case. There were just some people, or you might look at like liberal Protestantism today. Yeah, there's clearly people who are just being influenced by secular biblical studies or the sciences and their view of reality,
Right.
and they
Right.
have to
Right.
make sense of it, so they modify the
Yeah.
previous.
How do you fit like evolutionary theory into creationism? There's a natural gap there. Let me try and pose this to you.
Yeah, I've said a lot. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So the most convincing idea to me, so to speak, is this idea that if you look at it from an evolutionary process, you're pointing out that it happens in different places. There's scriptures, people are in the culture they're in, and then it just progresses from there, and they have their own modification principles. It's like from an evolutionary perspective, the idea is, and this is kind of goes back to the fundamental archetypal idea is, across the globe, across time, across cultures, independent of one another, they these archetypal patterns of narrative emerge, sort of like independent of one another, right? So every religion, so to speak, has these archetypes of a trickster archetype, or death and creation, and similar what would you say, imagery and ritual. So like the idea that I think Ernst Cassirer was it, studied different cultures and noticed that every religious tradition or mythology has this idea of light coming out of the darkness as the creation story. It's all the same. Or this idea of bowing before a higher power, right? These very like specific things. The idea is the structures of those narratives have to do with our embodiment as creatures. So like the bowing idea is, subordinate primates will bow before the alpha male, right? It's a subordination gesture. And so the idea that like bowing before a higher power, which is kind of a constant theme across religions, independent of one another, that is influenced by this sort of evolutionary process. And the idea is that across these cultures, the hero archetype, so to speak, is that pattern of behavior that is most evolutionarily successful, right? Like being both strong but also generous, right? Like chimpanzees who are capable of having physical strength but also engaging in reciprocal grooming. That is that pattern of behavior was selected for as the most as the behavior that, what would you say, was produced the most genetic fitness, so to speak. And the idea is that since humans are the same biologically, it's not a coincidence that the stories that emerged in these religions share a similar pattern, because they're all, the hero archetype idea is that they're all describing in their own sort of abstract way, with their own behavioral modifications and all that stuff, depending on where they are in the world or something. They're all describing in some way the pattern that is most conducive to evolutionary success. And that is what causes the consistency across these narratives. So like if you have a culture that's like a fishing culture, obviously their god is going to have something to do with, fishing. I think like one example he uses is like spear fishermen who go under the water and, they can breathe, they can hold their breath for like 10 minutes or something like that. So their mythology is centered around sort of this, like aquatic, god type deal. Whereas, a desert tribe is going to have a different mythology. But underneath that there's variation based on the environment. But underneath that, the same principles of sort of strength and, humility and generosity and all that, that underpins all of those stories, right? And that is the evolutionary grounding in which all these narratives emerge. And I think Peterson is ensconced in sort of the Christian idea, and he uses a lot of Christian imagery to describe it, in a way that we, in the West can understand it, because that's sort of our canonical cultural background. But I think that's a compelling argument to me, because because again, when you compare it to the animal, the ethological perspective and the neurological perspective, there is this consistent pattern underneath everything. And, getting to the bottom of that is sort of how we can say, okay, well, what is our fundamental nature, right? If all of these narratives emerged independent of one another, do these narratives explain something about our nature that we can apply today? And I think that's where the use is. And I agree, there's obviously so much nuance and complexity, and then comparing the different cultures and whatnot. But that consistency across cultures is what I think is, and this is, maybe we can get into this once you have a minute to respond, is sort of the bridging of the is-ought gap, so to speak. The fundamental faith claim that we have to postulate at the bottom of an epistemology. We can't rationally construct that, or the best we can do to rationally construct that is to look into our evolutionary past and see how that sort of, at what point are we starting from? And we get that from sort of mythological analysis. I know that's a lot, so, pick that apart.
I think in the first case, some of these patterns sort of aren't there cross-culturally, So I think one of the examples you gave about light coming from darkness, for example, being like this cross-cultural theme in creation myths. I'm not really convinced that that's there in Enuma Elish, or I'm not convinced that that's there in the Lao Shu world turtle story, or there's like this story about fleas, for example, or the stories of the Norse gods, which was, I forget what it was exactly, but it's something about them all like having sex with each other and like having sex with a horse or something. It's like really weird,
Sure.
But
Or
I think
gods coming out of the forehead of Zeus and all this stuff. Yeah,
there's just and I, I'm not sure that the piece of evidence that's being put forward is like, oh, look at all this commonality across cultures. But I think I agree there's some commonality across some cultures, and usually it turns out that the ones where there is commonality, share a common like history, and so it can usually be explained in terms of that.
Sure.
But cultures that are disconnected do tend to have quite different outlooks on the world and creation myths and things like that.
And I'm certainly not a well-read in this regard, and in some sense I'm taking it kind of on faith, so to speak, that the work of Carl Jung and Eric Neumann and Jordan Peterson are onto something. But you're right, it's not something that I'm like confident in myself, so to speak, in that I've seen it myself. But like there is interesting patterns of Jordan Peterson points out, like, where psychedelic usage occurs. This idea of like a world tree. There's like a world tree in Nordic mythology. There's like a world tree in, I don't know if it's Sri Lanka or something, but like places all over the world have these very different, cultures, obviously. But yet there's these very specific patterns that emerge. And so I think there's a risk of, certainly I don't know well enough to make claims 100% one way or the other.
So, there's more to be said, I guess. But the question is, do you think that, so there's the Scandinavian world tree, like Yggdrasil or whatever it's called, and then there's maybe this other culture that has a world tree as well. But do you think it could be the case that there's more evidence in favor of this? But do you think just being aware of those things is like good enough evidence to be like the basis of this inference then to that this is something that demands an explanation? Or do you think that at that point we should sort of withhold judgment and go,
sure,
actually I'm going to look into this more?
Yeah, well, definitely if it was just those two examples or something, then it's, you could chalk that up to coincidence. And in some sense it's like, we were tree-dwelling primates, right? So like, yes, to your point, that it requires a lot of, there's books and books and books on comparative religion and whatnot, and I have yet to delve into that. And so I'm putting these ideas forward as I understand them, not necessarily as the truth, so to speak. But I do think that, again, when you or the idea of bowing before a higher power, it's like that is really convincing to me that we are armed with these a priori cognitive structures that were evolved and selected for when we were primates, that other primates engage in, that also manifest themselves in mythology. Now, can we say, is there anything more to that? It's like, well, not in and of itself, but at least that to me is strong evidence that there are patterns there. and there is more to analyze, in that sense.
I think on the first point, this is like a general point that I want to raise about the kind of claims that Peterson makes, is that I agree that a lot of them are really kind of compelling or interesting or whatever. But I think the sort of epistemically responsible approach in a lot of these cases is to withhold judgment and think, well, I need to, like, there's a lot that's the upshot of this line of reasoning. So I need to kind of like take my time and figure out, what stands
Sure.
behind each of these things. But for me right now, I don't like believe in the conclusion. Like
Oh
I'm just
yeah.
going to kind of like not
Sure.
have a judgment about it or something. On the case of the evolutionary points, yeah, I mean, so suppose that is the case, and I don't know if it is or isn't. There's a kind of line of argument called like an evolutionary debunking argument, right? And the idea behind evolutionary debunking arguments is that there's some kind of phenomena, right, which people take to be veridical or truthful in reality. So I mean, it might be morality or something like that. So people take morality when people make moral statements. It's wrong to murder children for fun or something like that. A moral realist is standardly saying, well, that's like a proposition, and again, there's a ton to be said about what propositions are, but that's like a proposition about the way reality is. That's true, right? Okay. An evolutionary debunking argument is going to be something that offers an explanation for why, like, primates like us would have that belief, but that isn't truth tracking. So the idea of it
Like
is if
metaphorical
you
truth, kind of. You're familiar with Brett Weinstein's concept, or
yeah, I I don't know if it's I don't know if it fits into that.
okay,
I mean, there's maybe more that could be said, but the idea is that you can provide an explanation for the thing that needs to be explained, but the explanation actually entails that the belief is the result of these non-rational, non-truth tracking processes. And so actually, even though you have the belief, or you might say someone is justified in having the belief because they're a product of evolution, the belief itself isn't actually true, right?
right, right,
And I sort of see the conclusion of what Peterson's saying here as actually being a kind of evolutionary debunking argument against religion, which for which the upshot should be, so religion isn't actually true in the sense that most theists take it to be when they talk about it.
right, right. Which
And
goes
now,
back to the point.
oh,
I
sorry,
think
you're
that's.
muted. I think I
Oh,
can't.
am I?
So I mean, what I said was just broadly something like these evolutionary debunking arguments. What they do is they sort of offer a non-truth tracking explanation for the kind of
Right.
phenomena. And so if you are kind of like committed to that phenomena, to that explanation of the phenomena, then you should sort of like not believe that the phenomena itself is like true, right?
Sure, sure. And so this could maybe, and we can maybe, this can be kind of the last topic we get into. Um, this idea of like, did you watch the Jordan Peterson Sam Harris debates by any chance?
Years ago, so I'm
Yes.
not gonna.
Okay.
It's
No,
not
no
gonna
worries.
be-
The fundamental issue there was sort of like bridging the is-ought gap in this idea of like metaphorical truth. So my perspective, and you can tell me what you think, is like I do not believe you can create a purely rational moral framework that does not start from sort of a faith claim. That the fundamental axioms on which you build a moral system or an epistemology, they have to be like something has to be taken for granted. And one of those things is like suffering is bad, right? Like if you put, like Sam Harris, you put your hand on a stove, like a hot stove, you're going to feel pain. That speaks in and of itself, right? And so you can kind of ground it um, on that perspective. And then Peterson says, well, is that really a fact, so to speak? And I guess like my perspective is to the truth claim idea is like we're not built for, to your point, we're not built for understanding the objective truth, so to speak. We're built for understanding metaphorical truth, in that if it's true enough and it serves us, we'll consider it true, and we can fit it into our framework or whatever. And like in Peterson's debate with Dillahunty, like Dillahunty lays out this sort of secular humanist framework where he says we can say that death is preferable to life, well-being is good and all that, and then from there we can build a system or whatever. And like that makes sense to me. I think the issue is like those claims are not objective facts, so to speak. Like the claim that like life is preferable to death. It's like, well, people commit suicide, and you could argue like euthanasia can be justified in certain circumstances. So I guess like do you think that you can create a kind of a moral framework or an epistemology solely through rationality, detached from sort of this underlying, what would you say, evolutionarily derived sort of metaphorical truth, sense-making apparatuses? Or that might be too broad of a question, but...
So I think it's okay. There's a few things I can say about that. I think my view of Harris's understanding of ethics is just that he doesn't really understand the state of the discourse in philosophy at all on it. I don't really see a serious attempt on his behalf to even like read an introduction to ethics book and like talk about the various different positions and stuff. He made a 3-tweet thing about how he solved the problem, and
he solved the is-ought-gat in 3 tweets. Yeah. He's
and so one thing to be said is that philosophers don't really view the is-ought gap as something to be solved. It's just a description. It's just a description of 2 different categories of thing. It's like saying there's like a number color gap, right? We need to solve the number color gap. Well, no one's trying to solve like a gap between numbers and colors. It's just a description of 2 different categories of things. And so the is-ought gap, which is something introduced by Hume, is just to say that basically, so like a fact in and of itself isn't like motivating, basically. So that there's different kinds of aspects, I suppose, of our own psychology that we're trying to provide a theory that accounts for. We want to provide a theory for like true statements about the way that the world is. So, like this pen is in my hand or something like that, and the relationship of my mind to it. But we also want to provide a theory about what it is for me to be motivated to do certain things. So, I mean, motivation includes like motivation to go and get food when I'm hungry, or drink water when I'm thirsty. But there's also kind of like normative, kind of like moral motivations. So like you should do something. Like what am I talking about when I say I should do it? Well, I should do it because it's good. Like what does that mean? And it's that shouldness seems to be like a different kind of thing to a purely descriptive fact. But philosophers in general aren't trying to like bridge the gap. That what they're trying to do is come up with the best explanation that can account for like these different aspects of our like psychological makeup or our linguistic practices. Like we talk about should and we talk about good. Well, is there a difference there? How does reality stand behind the way we use our language? Okay, so there are different ways that people view these things, and I'm sort of I'm sort of skeptical of the whole project of theology to engage, the project of philosophy to engage in these questions. But standardly, the discourse pivots around this thing called like reasons internalism versus reasons externalism. So are there, do motivating reasons have to be reasons that are like internally related to a person's desire, or are there like externally motivating reasons? So like things reasons that exist out there in the world as it is, like mind independently, and we somehow perceive or interact with them and they motivate us in certain ways. And that's usually how the discourse sort of proceeds. So like my friend James Fodor, who I mentioned earlier, he is an atheist, reductive naturalist, and a moral realist, and he subscribes to Peter Railton's theory, which is like an externalist theory about reasons. So he thinks that there are facts about the way the world is such that they motivate people to take certain actions, and that's what we're talking about when we say should and stuff like that. I mean, my whole view of the situation more recently is a little bit more pessimistic, I suppose. I mean, I look at these things as just words that we use, like, good, should, and we're socialized into appropriate ways of using these words and inappropriate. I mean, if you want me to flesh out a bit more of a theory about what I think is going on, I mean, personally, I think it's something quite close to Hume's own theory of motivation, which is that reason's basically a slave of the desires, so we just have like passions to do things. But he says it's no more irrational to desire to scratch my little to will to scratch the itch on my little finger than it is to will the destruction of the world, right? And in a sense, in the theory, he's kind of right, but I think he's also wrong because of, and this is something that we could talk about, because of the irrational background commitments that I have that make up the linguistic and social practices that I'm nested in. Well, then actually it would be irrational for me to will the destruction of the
Sure.
world because it goes against all of those things. But I mean, if we had nothing else but the theory, I mean that would sort of follow from it. Sorry, I'm saying so much stuff, and it's going to be difficult to find a place
Yeah.
in that.
And I'm asking very broad questions, so I don't make it that much easier.
I mean, is there anything in that is of interest, or you want you to say more about?
Well, I guess so. Like when I think about like my project, what I'm trying to do is, I'm trying to take a very practical, the things that I'm ultimately concerned about are like polarization in society and how to, why are people so committed to these different belief systems. And it does seem to me that, what would you say? Like these underlying questions of like the is-ought gap and can we start on fundamental agreements? Like I think we have to plant our flag somewhere. We have to have a starting point that is like not subject to rational deconstruction, so to speak. And that's why, like, looking at the religious stories of like, here's how we got here. Here's, ever since childhood, we were socialized in a certain culture, and that culture was, has a long historical lineage and had evolutionary pressures selected against it, arguably, because I think like Dawkins and other people would say, no, memes were not around long enough to have pressures selected on them. I guess.
Well, maybe there's something I think I can say to this
Yeah.
at this point. So, again, it's almost impossible to say anything about any of these things without making a bunch of assumptions in philosophy, right, about the way the world is. So some people, I mean, a lot of religious people, for example, are going to object to what I have to say about some of these things on the basis that they disagree with the picture that I'm painting of epistemology. So they might be foundationalists or moderate foundationalists, where they don't look at our beliefs in the way that I do because they think that our beliefs kind of bottom out in a way where they actually like attach to the way reality is, and we can't be wrong about that. And those are like basic or foundational beliefs, and some of those might be moral commitments. My personal view is different. I'm something closer to a coherentist, so I sort of think we have a web of beliefs that sits together. Now, within that web, how things are related to each other, some things are more foundational, so to speak, in that they inform more of the beliefs we hold. So, to modify that belief, it's going to affect the whole network. Maybe you need like a ton more evidence or something to overcome like
Sure.
one of those beliefs or something else, which is kind of different from what the foundationalist wants to say, because they wants to say, well, like, no, the foundational commitments, they really are the way the world is, or I can't be wrong about them and things like that. Now, I actually think that a lot of those more foundational commitments in our web of beliefs are held on the basis that they're just irrational, right? We've not adopted them because of sort of speculation about the way the world is or coming to truths of pure reason or anything like that. But we've just been socialized into adopting them from the cultures that we're kind of like raised in. We're taught to behave in certain ways or to have language, to speak in certain ways or use certain turns of phrases or gestures or whatever. And these things quite fundamentally inform the way that we view the world and think of things as how we are. Now they seem very, very important, or like they could never change. And I think in general they don't change, but I still think that they can change over time. So a good analogy here is between a river and a riverbed. So the riverbed stays approximately still as the river flows through it.
Sure.
But over time, the river kind of influences the riverbed and can move things, and the riverbed, the sediment comes up into the river, and that changes too. And I think you see that sort of thing happening when someone who's raised in a very fundamentalist religious household grows up to become an atheist, or vice versa, someone who's an atheist grows up, and has some experience or whatever, and they wind up joining a Christian community and becoming a Christian. I think those are some, you see some of those foundational commitments about the way reality is there being changed over time. And as much as I engage in the kind of philosophy of religion debate quite frequently, but I don't really see anyone doing this after just hearing the Kalam cosmological argument or something. Like, yeah, I just can't deny the premises, and I see it more as the result of people having life experiences and
and
joining communities that shape and change the way they are or relate to the world, and that's in line with that model of belief change.
And I think definitely, and I think Peterson pointed this out in he had a conversation with, I think it's Muhammad Hijab or something like that, who's a famous Muslim theologist. And I really liked what he said. He was like, the whole attempt on the part of apologists to do this sort of suppositionalism, and we're going to take a pure logical approach. It's like, it seems to me the most convincing aspects of religion are on the phenomenological side, right? Like, people have experiences and the community and all that. And so these like, the contingency arguments, and there has to be something constraining logically. I don't know it full well. I don't really understand it and look into it too much. But this, we'll make a rational, logical, coherent for God. It's like, that's not where, in the practical sense. Right. That's not, when we have all the problems in society, it's like, it's not because we're disagreeing on the logic, so to speak. It's because people are taking their sort of phenomenological experiences and setting that as primary, which again, I think that's where, like, I think there is value in like religious language and sort of the religious framework of things, because it takes certain phenomenological things for granted that we can't necessarily take at a rational perspective, I guess.
Well, I think so. My view here does have something a bit. I don't think that there's perception that isn't theory laden. So, like, our percepts of the way that reality is, and the mental content that we associate with those percepts, right? There aren't like givens of perception on my coherentist view. So the raw experience, right, of the way that things seem to me visually, for example, doesn't sort of present itself as like computer monitor or something like that in terms of the propositional content.
Yeah, right.
Unless it's my beliefs that sort of like interpret the percepts that I'm seeing.
Like Peterson gives the example of like, if you get a letter from a university with like whether or not you're accepted in it, and like your whole life is kind of riding on it. It's like, that's not just a letter, that's imbued with all kinds of emotional content and whatnot. Right.
Yeah, it's like that. And I think so. I don't know that I would kind of sign up to the idea that there are these perceptual givens of religious experience that, devoid of any like background beliefs or whatever, someone would form the belief on the basis of having them, that was God or something. Because I think that there's always going to be like a Michael Shermer or a Matt Dillahunty that would have that experience, and their beliefs are going to inform the experience in such a way that they don't. And so I think you need the socialization into someone who's something that's quite funny to do, at least from my point of view, is you can put the testimonies of Hare Krishnas and Mormons and Christians and Muslims talking about a burning warm feeling in their heart as they kind of like experience God or whatever, next to each other, and they sound virtually identical in terms of what they're saying, and then you kind of get to the last bit and it's like, and that was Krishna, or that was the Holy Spirit,
or Allah.
And so I think it's clear that what's going on in these cases is that the background theological commitments of the communities that they're nested in are informing the way that they come to interpret the experiences that they're having, whatever those experiences are. But yeah, I think that on my view, there is a sort of legitimate place for religion and religious discourse. I think it's misconceived to look at religion as a primitive attempt at doing science or something like that.
Agreed.
Like sort of some people tend to. I think that religious discourse is just another form of life that is out there for people to sort of like adopt or socialize themselves into, pick up the practices of, if they want to. But then the kind of thing that I engage in is when I see that as being harmful for people or clashing with shared hinge commitments that I have with people that I think are more important. So it might be to do with being like living a healthy life, right, and flourishing, or it might be to do with
Acquiring power or
sexuality or
something.
politics.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be any of these things. And when I see those things as clashing, then I have then I want to sort of provide I want to play a game that we both share, which is called like the rationality game, where we provide each other reasons for believing things and stuff like that. And I'm going to try and provide reasons that are going to move them away. I mean, maybe they'll still stay religious, right? I don't really care, but are going to at least vindicate what I see as being the important shared hinge commitment that they might be at risk of jettisoning because of their religious beliefs. But I think, I don't think that. Also, I don't know the right way of saying that, but yeah, I do think that religious practices and activities are perfectly legitimate in a sense. The problem is that nothing that I'm saying about religious practices and activities is generally going to be accepted by someone who's conservative. When they say my mother died and went to heaven or whatever, at a funeral, she really loved God, she was a holy woman. They're going to say, no, I really mean that, right? And what I'm saying is, well, these are kind of a bunch of activities and practices that you engage in because it makes sense of life in this way for you. They're not going to kind of accept that. And I'm going to be like, yeah, I agree that you completely mean that, but I'm just disagreeing that that's what's really happening. And they're not going to accept my kind of explanation there. But my explanation does say, yeah, that's just as legitimate as, when atheists say, I'm sending you my thoughts and prayers or whatever, when something bad happens.
Right.
These things play a role in our forms of life that we occupy and live in.
Yeah. What was I think Sam Harris made the point of like in order to be convinced by logic, and evidence, you have to accept that logic and evidence are valid, means of epistemology. And it's like, depending on the fundamentalist, you can reject that. And yeah, like, when it's so tied to emotion and whatnot, that's one of the things about, like, Sam Harris said something to the effect of, the only tool we have for changing people's minds is conversation. And I disagree with that a lot, because I think like art and film and sort of these extra linguistic means of communication, that gets underneath the sort of suppositionalist perspective that a lot of people take.
Yeah. I agree with that, but I still think as well, I think it also depends on having those shared hinge commitments between cultures, because I think if you turn up, on the Sentinelese island and show them the Lion King or something, like they'll shoot you with arrows and maybe like eat you or something. Right?
Yeah. Well, on the simplest, it's like, you show a film in a different language, it's not going to have the same impact, right? So
right. Exactly.
So that cultural. So yeah. So the archetype, whatever the fundamental narrative structure, has to be conditioned by the culture that people are in, for sure. Well, hey, so yeah, I think we can wrap up. I want to ask this last question, then if you have anything you want to ask, go ahead. But this is something I learned from Lex Friedman, and just take this however you want. It's going to be a broad question. But from your perspective, how old are you?
I'm 25 now.
Okay, 25, same. So we're both at 25 years of our life. How would you answer the question, what is the meaning of life?
I don't think there is a meaning, right? I think there's many meanings of life, and they depend on so many factors, contextual factors about someone's background and history and the situation that they're in, that I couldn't possibly say. And this isn't that kind of like aphorism isn't my line, right? To say I think that it's actually Viktor Frankl who said that in Man's Search for Meaning, that one of the things that he came to find out is there isn't like a meaning of life, but there's just multiple meanings, and that isn't to say, because it might seem like an easy counterexample to provide would be to say something to the effect of, well, if I enjoy, like committing genocide or something, then right, and that's my meaning, then it's not to say there's not like more or less legitimate.
Right. I'm sure Hitler felt what he was doing was meaningful, right? Yeah.
Yeah. There are less legitimate forms of meaningful ways of living, especially given my background commitments about the way that the world is. But I don't think I can just say to someone, pick up your cross and bear it or something, because that's not, that might be right for someone in certain contexts, it might not be right for someone else in other contexts. So I think that sensitivity to those contextual kind of like features are going to be needed by each individual person, and they're going to have to figure out for themselves what leads to their flourishing, really, as a person.
Right.